Hello and welcome to this edition of the Golf Channel Podcast with Rex and Lav. Cam Davis is the winner of the Rocket Mortgage Classic in a tournament I think, Rex, will be defined by Akshay Bhatia's 72nd hole three-putt, as well as the grace he showed afterward, and the continued inability of Cameron Young to notch his first career victory on the PGA Tour. What stood out to you about the day, what was pretty hectic over there in Motown?
It was Akshay's three putt from 34 feet. His only three putt of the entire week. Really bad timing. He felt like he was trending in that direction. Certainly the week before, what he had done at the Travelers Championship, you thought that, all right, he's put himself through this before. He had won on the PGA Tour before. Of all the players that were in the mix coming down the stretch, he's the one I probably had the most confidence in. So there was a bit of a surprise, and you probably touched on it. And I'm going to say this, and I'm sure the folks in the comment section aren't going to like it. But as I watched the final round on Sunday, I was taken by the idea that if you just parachuted in, and I didn't tell you any context of what you were watching or what these people were doing on TV, if you sat and watched Cameron Young and Davis Thompson play golf, you had to think that they were being held against their will, that they were doing this against their will. They were the most unhappy people I've ever seen on the planet. And both of them played well. Well, I'll say Davis Thompson played well coming down the stretch to post a good finish was just what he needed at this point in the season. Cam Young looked like he was about to do a murder-suicide. I mean, let's call it for what it is. And he was aggravated. I know he snapped his driver, so that probably aggravated him. He made a bunch of mental errors. That probably aggravated him. But if I just had to go out on a limb and tell you, okay, of all the things this robot could do with the golf ball, and statistically, he is amazing what he can do with the golf ball. He's one of the best ball strikers in the game at the moment. If you had to ask me, why hasn't he won on the PGA Tour and why do we continue to have these conversations about him? It has to be his attitude, right? And I think the crew on the CBS call kind of pointed it out that this is probably working against him at this point, that you made a mistake. And what the top players will do, they'll leave it behind and they'll move on and they'll find a way to overcome and adapt and either win or not win. In this particular case, it looked like he was done when he snapped his driver. You could tell mentally he was finished. He was not going to have a chance. And that to me is amazing for a player at that level.
I wish I could reference the exact tweet and give proper credit, but I saw on social media on Sunday night that Cameron Young is essentially Detroit era Matt Stafford, a player who is immensely talented and yet can never win because either of the teammates around him or some of the self-imposed mistakes that he makes. And Cameron Young to me is that player. Like, there is no disputing. I think it's inarguable at this point that he is the best player on the PGA Tour without a victory. He is in historic territory in that he has 7 runner-up finishes on the PGA Tour without a win. That's the most since the PGA Tour started keeping those statistics in 1983. And the thing about Cam Young that I've always found interesting is that in those final rounds in which he's had those runner-up finishes, he's never shot worse than 70. So essentially, he is just getting beat. Right? Like he's not typically beating himself. He's not imploding in the final round. Like someone else, think about Cam Young or Cam Smith in the 2022 Open Championship. Like he just went out and shot 64 and that was the winner that day. There wasn't much that Cam Young could do about that. But you have to think that it's now begun to take a toll. And you're exactly right that he looks so miserable on the golf course. He acknowledges that this has been an ongoing battle. Cam Young does. And he's talked a lot recently about working on the mental side. And he thought that he'd been making strides in that aspect. I think it's indisputable that Sunday in Detroit was a big time setback for whatever strides that he had made on the mental aspect. Shooting 38 on the back nine, the snap driver on 14. He was one of the last in the field in putting on Sunday. He missed 4 times inside 10 feet. He had big misses with gap wedge. Just couldn't even hit the green. And so at this stage of his career, Cam Young reminds me a lot of Wyndham Clark, a player who, again, immensely talented, all the talent in the world. It's obvious to anyone who watches him, but he's mired in sort of despair and he's miserable on the golf course because he was not meeting his own expectations. What does Wyndham Clark do? He links up with renowned sports psychologist Julie Elion. And even though Wyndham Clark is not perfect now, it's not all of a sudden fixed and he knows how to really comport himself inside the ropes. He at least has the tools now to be kinder to himself on the golf course. I think it would really behoove Cam Young to sort of follow that direction and seek some help. He's never going to be the happy-go-lucky Akshay Bhatia inside the ropes, right? Like that's clearly not his personality. He's a very quiet guy. I don't think he's necessarily mean-spirited or nasty. That's just sort of the player he morphs into inside the ropes. I'd love to see someone help him to unlock the gifts that are just obvious to anyone who follows golf.
Well, and even in the post-round interview that Amanda did with Cam Davis, it was amazing him talking about the idea that he had gotten to a point where he didn't feel like he was playing his best golf. So he went to a hypnotherapist. So it gives you an idea of the lengths that these players go to. I think what we've seen really the last 3 weeks on the PGA Tour is the mental impact that the toll that the mental side of the game takes. Certainly you go back to Pinehurst with Rory McIlroy. He does not miss those putts coming down the stretch. That was 100% mental. There was nothing technical about that. 100% mental. You look at last week. Well, he was what, 467 for 467 going into the 16th hole for putts inside 3 feet. Like there's nothing statistically that you can point at and say, okay, well, he does this with his putting stroke, so that makes him vulnerable in this situation. No, that's not the case. Like
he almost whiffed the putt on the 72nd hole. He hit it like top half of the equator, which is what he's somewhat struggled against. Again, that was a 4 foot slider.
That's not technical. That's not technical. That's clearly a mental. That's clearly a mental side of the game. Like that can't be technical. When you're 467 for 467 on the putts inside 3 feet, that's a pretty good case study. You have the stats out right there in front of you that, nope, I can do this. I'm really, really good at this. It's just I get in these situations and I start to feel the pressure. You look at Bhatia last week at the Travelers Championship. Clearly, there were issues coming down the stretch where his game, which is just filled with talent and so much promise, just didn't seem comfortable in that situation. And now you have this, which was a perfect example of this player was in full flight. He should have been the one that challenged for the title coming from the pack. When you looked at the start of Sunday and you kind of broke it down, he was the one that I pointed to and went, yeah, of course, he's going to be the one. Because, again, he's a robot. He puts himself into this position probably more than anyone else on the PGA Tour, certainly more than anyone else who hasn't won on the PGA Tour. And yet somehow he's not able to get it done. And you're right. Like, he needs to probably take a step back. And when you have a caddy of the abilities of Paul Tesori, who was on Cam's bag for a long time. And Paul had been on Webb Simpson's bag for a really long time. He knows the mental side of the game. He plays the game. He understands
it. DJ's bag, who is one of the most demanding players of all time.
And now Tom Kim's bag, which is also brings its own set of challenges. So like Paul has put himself in situations where he needs to use what he's good at, which is being able to put a player in a good headspace, despite the situation. Like take the situation out of it. For Paul, and not to be able to do whatever it is, the magic that he does, the secret sauce that he's able to apply to these players, I think that speaks volumes. And I don't know what happened in the relationship between Cam and Paul. I don't know who decided to walk away from whom, but it seems to me in this situation, he needs a Paul Tesori. He needs a sports psychologist. He needs a mental therapist. Whatever the case may be, he needs something to get him over that hump because just his pure game alone clearly isn't good enough.
I know you just hope that he will do that self-reflection and make those changes because he really could be a multiple winner every season on the PGA Tour. Like that, those are the obvious gifts that he possesses. Like after he snapped his driver, I think every other player in the field would have been absolutely doomed. That all of a sudden they were resigned to having to hit 3-wood off the tee for 3 of the remaining 4 holes. The other one was the par 3. And yet he still gave himself chances. He's still rocketing 315-yard 3-woods with ball speeds in the upper 170s. Like it's so obvious that he is this immense talent. And again, a sports psychologist would not all of a sudden change Cam Young's personality. That is not their job. And I don't think it would come naturally to Cam Young to do so. It's more just learning to give himself grace. It's pretty obvious that he runs hot, that he puts a lot of pressure on himself. He's been groomed from a very young age to be a professional golfer. His dad is a longtime PGA professional. He's still his swing coach, his primary swing coach. Like it's probably clear that there is sort of a burden of expectation that lives on Cam Young's shoulders. You just hope someone can give him the tools to kind of take a step back, to have some sort of debrief, and allow his skill set to shine more naturally than it is right now, because it just looks painful to watch. It looks like he's miserable on the golf course. Again, I don't think he is miserable in the dealings that I've had with him personally. I found him actually to be pretty accommodating and pretty kind. But it's clear that he is morphing to a different player inside the ropes, and it's not helping him get to that next level.
I think that's fair. From the outside looking in, you're right. It looks 100% like he's miserable. It looks like he's being held against his will. All of those things that we've made fun of him about. I'm sure deep down on the inside, there's something churning that he has to enjoy this, because there's no way you put yourself through this if you don't enjoy it. I'll go back to a conversation I had at Bay Hill with one of the officials from TGL, the league that he's going to be a part of. And we were talking about the idea, and I think we touched on this on the podcast last week, that has to be almost 100% entertainment. Like, the competition part of that's going to be such a small sliver. Like, I'm curious about the technology, but the actual competition side is just going to be a really small sliver. And my question was, does Cam understand that? Does he understand that he has to get on stage now, that he can't be that guy that walks around that looks like he's being held against his will? That can he walk around and he's like, look, we've had these conversations with him, and he has assured us that there is a side of him that he's looking forward to letting the world see. So for no other reason, I can't wait to see that first match with Cam Young, because I'd love to see that side of him. I think I said this story before. You're right. Like, on the golf course, he doesn't look like he's enjoying himself. That can't be the case deep down and inside. And I think I told this story. It was 2 years ago at the Hero World Challenge. And I think he was finishing up on a Saturday afternoon. And I'd gone down to like the scoring area to talk to another player. And he had finished up his rounds and he was signing autographs. And I noticed how engaged he was with the fans. And they were laughing. And like, at this point, now I'm kind of locked in. Like, what's going on down here? Like, who is this guy? And he gets done signing the autographs and he sort of sprints up the stairs to the clubhouse. And there's like a kid who had been at the end of the line. He didn't see him. And he like yells his name and he like turns and his face brightens and he runs back down the stairs. And I'm like, man, where is that guy when he's playing golf? Because I never see him on the golf course.
Like at the Travelers Championship in the third round when he shot 59, like that was not even a moment that allowed him to exude joy or happiness. It was almost like a flip switch in his mind, like, now I'm heading into the final round of a Travelers Championship
Shot 58.
with a shot to win the golf tournament. Like, that's what my focus is now. And if I don't do that, the whole week's going to be a disappointment. Again, I like Cam Young personally. I think a lot of his peers like Cam Young personally. You just hope that probably during this offseason, he can get some help and he comes in 2025 with sort of a different perspective, a different outlook, a different inside the ropes comportment. I did want to give a shout out, Rex, to Akshay Bhatia, who did play his last 11 holes and 1 over par, the 3-putt on the 72nd green from 32 feet, missed a 4-footer. But Akshay, 22 years old, took 5 questions from the media afterward. That, of course, is 5 more questions than Rory McIlroy got after his U.S. Open defeat. I'm not comparing the 2 players. I'm not comparing the 2 events. But I did want to give a shout out to Akshay because that takes courage and that takes professionalism to do what he did after blowing the tournament in the manner in which he did. At 22, to me, he has such a long road ahead of him. And I think moves like this can really endear him to fans. There's a lot to like about him. Akshay turned pro at 17. Remember, he missed those 7 consecutive cuts to start. It took him 3 years to get even on the Corn Ferry Tour. There was a lot of talk about, this kid make a mistake not going to college. Is he going to flame out early? He has really reinvented himself, particularly with that long putter. And as he sits now on the PGA Tour, he's 9th in strokes gained total, a very complete player. He is not without flaws. I think we saw that on Sunday in Detroit. But man, what a fun, fearless kid who is already becoming a fan favorite. Although the President's Cup rankings have not updated yet. He was 13th.
I think he's going to move to 6th or 7th.
Yeah, like I'd love to see him on that American team as they start to build for the future, even if it comes at expense of some other veteran players.
I was taken, even before the 72nd hole, and fill in your own punchline, however you want to do this. I was taken watching him coming down the stretch of how much he plays the game like Phil Mickelson did in Phil Mickelson's prime. Because there is a grace, there is a poetry to his swing. I do like watching him play golf. However, if you look at his stats, he's not the best driver of the golf ball. He was squarely middle of the pack going into Sunday last weekend. I think what drives me is the idea that he plays the game the way Phil did, though. It's a lot of feel. It's a lot of imagination. When he gets on the greens, you can see the way the artist is coming out in him. And then what happens on the 72nd hole? Like, you're going to have these extremes when it comes to him. One of the questions I think I posed you and I are going on a roundtable later this morning on Golf Today. One of the questions was, is he the best under 25 player on the PGA Tour? And in my mind, it's a competition between he and Tom Kim, and we'll probably pick that apart a little bit better later on this afternoon. However, like when you look at what he's accomplished, and you're right, and the amount of time he did it and how much he's matured, because I'll go back to, I had a couple conversations with him in San Antonio this year, and I just think he's a different person. He's a different player. Certainly the Grayson Murray tragedy impacted him in a way that you're seeing him focus those energies in a way that I didn't see earlier in his career. Again, 17-year-old kid, you don't expect to see him focusing energies very well, but clearly he's in a place now where I love watching him play golf, because he's sort of a little bit more refined, a little bit quieter version of Phil Mickelson. And I like that. It's entertaining to me.
I'll have to chew on that topic. I've got 4 hours to kill before our hit on Golf Today, in which we will kick around whether Akshay Bhatia is the best player under 25. That's a good one. That could be a media discussion. Make sure you guys tune in around noon Eastern time on Monday when Rex and I bat that one around. Rex, what did you think of the Rocket Mortgage Classic in general? To me, heading into the week, this was one of the tournaments that you and I were not particularly excited about. I don't think many fans were excited about. It sort of seemed like the prime example of a tournament that the PGA Tour could lose at really no expense to its overall product. But I think what the week showed at Detroit Golf Club is that the PGA Tour, for these full field events, what can happen when you lean into these younger players instead of the rank and file that exists on the PGA Tour. People will scream that that's essentially just going to make the PGA Tour full field events, the Korn Ferry Tour on steroids. But the PGA Tour's middle class is like a known commodity. We know what they are. They'll bounce back and forth between the PGA Tour and the Korn Ferry Tour. They may pop up for a handful of top 25 finishes throughout the year, but there really is no staying power. But there's so much potential in a Luke Clanton, who spent the majority of the weekend inside the top five, the rising junior at Florida State. There is so much potential there with Neil Shipley, the low amateur at both the Masters and the U.S. Open, who was making his pro debut last week in Detroit. There's certainly, Rex, is a lot of potential with a 15-year-old like Miles Russell, who played and made his PGA Tour debut, as well as Jackson Coyven, who is the NCAA Player of the Year from 2024. All four of those players were inside the field at the Rocket Mortgage Classic. As you zoom ahead this week to the John Deere Classic, you have Clanton, you have Shipley, you have Michael Thorne Bjornsson, you have Cole Sherwood, a standout player from Vanderbilt. Like, this is what these full field events should be. Leaning into the future, providing a runway. Maybe one of them makes a run like Luke Clanton. And it just makes even though he's returning to college, it could make their professional debuts, their first years on tour, that much easier, just giving them the experience as opposed to sort of just trotting out the middle class, the rank and file, the mules, whatever you want to call them.
I didn't want this pod to become a pre-show meeting, but that's what it's going to become. Because one of the topics that I wanted to throw out there was the idea of something you touched on last week, where now that we can look back at the signature events this year, you didn't particularly like sort of the ebb and flow of the schedule, the cadence of the schedule. My counter to that was, yes, I will grant you that having the Memorial, U.S. Open, and Travelers in consecutive weeks is not a recipe for very, very good golf. What you end up with at the end of that road is really tired golfers who just want to go home and rest for a few weeks. However, the other side of that is what we had this weekend, and to a certain degree, what we're going to have this week at the John Deere Classic. You're absolutely right. I mean, these events delivered, if the signature events ended up delivering what we wanted them to, which was getting the top players together more often, and we can both agree that happened. I think the full field events, when you look at this, the Rocket Mortgage Classic, as a microcosm of what the tour was trying to do, 100% delivered. And I'm not even going to drill down as deep as you did with some of the amateurs that you referred to, but Cam Davis winning, clearly a young, talented player. We've already talked about Bhatia, young, talented player. Minwoo Lee, Davis Thompson, Eric Cole, last year's Rookie of the Year, Cameron Young, Nick Dunlap. All of these players are all inside the top 10. You're right. It's probably not going to be the tournament that your average golf fan tunes into, excited, wanting to see. But it is, if you're an avid golf fan, if you're passionate about being part of the game, then you're going to watch this because you know what you're seeing in that top 10 is going to end up on a leaderboard somewhere down the road. Scottish Open, Open Championship, playoffs next year in the signature events, somewhere along the line.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't necessarily have to be the snapshot in time on June 30th. It's projecting what could be. Like if you took a screen grab of what the leaderboard looked like with Akshay Bhatia, who was being chased down by Minwoo Lee, Davis Thompson, Luke Clanton was inside the top 5. Like that was a dream scenario for the PG Tour and what a full field event could be. Again, the purists who love and appreciate the tour's middle class and they want to see the Matt Kuchars and the Webb Simpsons of the world. Like I get that. And there's probably an avenue for that too. But the full field events should really lean into these young players and giving them the starts and the opportunities. The Travelers Championship, before it became a signature event, always leaned into the young players. The John Deere Classic throughout its history, Jordan Spieth among them, has always given opportunities
Wyndham
to the young
Championship,
players to get their start. There's
Mark
a
Brazel, the
handful of
tournament director there,
tournaments
has always done that. Yeah.
that have done that. And I get now it's easier to do that because the college season is over, but you'd love to see more tournaments take that approach, sort of cherry pick the best players, the best young players in the Corn Ferry Tour and give them tour starts as well. Hats off to the Rocket Mortgage Classic. I do think actually we'll see a similar leaderboard unfold this week for the John Deere Classic. Is there anything else, Rex, you wanted to get into before we go and wrap up this recap podcast?
I did. I was really, really curious to see Newport Country Club, which hosted the U.S. Senior Open this week, just because it's such a cool layout. I had the opportunity to play it once. It's one of those great classic American golf courses. So I wanted to tune in, and it's finishing up today on Monday. What we saw for at least the first 3 days under perfect conditions is exactly what I think the USGA does really well, where they're willing to go back to these classic venues and set them up in a way that it can make it competitive to the modern pro, even the modern over 50 pro. However, I will say this. I have not given the USGA many bogeys along the way, certainly the last few years, certainly since Mike Wan took over. And we both agree that he's a dynamic and very interesting leader. On this, the USGA clearly bogeyed. And I only say this, and our colleague Eamon Lynch last week on Golf Today brought it up. And as I'm watching the telecast this weekend and listening to the passion and Brad Faxon's voice, who was a member at Newport Country Club, he had hoped to get a special invitation into the Senior Open. They did not give him a special invitation to the U.S. Senior Open. I think that's a huge whiff. I think there's a reason why you have these opportunities to fill out a 156 player field. He's not really going to take a spot from someone else. And the passion that Brad has for this golf course and this area and how important he's been to New England golf, I think that's a huge bogey.
Very fair. Did seem like a eyebrow-raising omission by the USGA. I'm sure they had their justifications. I've yet to see a very good one in print, but I'm with you. Again, this is the U.S. Senior Open. It's not like they're being inundated with requests, and certainly that one made a lot of sense. Again, that the resumption of the final round begins shortly over there on Golf Channel and Peacock. We'll be tuning in. Newport Country Club does look like a golf course I need to play. Again, Rex, you and I will be on Golf Today in about 3 hours' time. That's why we're keeping this podcast shorter than usual, where we'll be bandying about a number of other topics. You and I will also be back for the Golf Channel podcast with Rex and Lav on Wednesday for a full preview of the John Deere Classic, where I'm sure we'll be leaning hard into the Jordan Spieth storyline. Has not played that tournament in a number of years. The Deere, of course, launched his career in 2013 with that dramatic hole out to win his first event on the PGA Tour when he was off and running. But we'll do that on Wednesday. In the meantime, you guys know the drill. NBCSports.com/golf for our latest news, notes, and updates. Talk to you guys in about 48 hours or so. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the support. See you then.
You got it that time.